So thank you everyone for joining me in this brave new world of remote seminars and court cases. As many of my cases have been adjourned to an unknown time in the future, I've had a lot of time on my hands. So I wrote a blog on something that's been pretty much obsessing me, which is COVID-19 a Barder event? Hopefully you've all seen my blog, which is the full-length version of an e-shot that Anthony sent out last week. If you haven't seen it, then you'll find the link on the email that invited you to this webinar, or just Google Leisha on Law WordPress, and it should pop up. I'm not going to just read this out because it's there for you to look at your leisure, but I will give a very brief recap before I go to look at this in a bit more detail and on a bit more of a practical level. I'll also look at the impact of COVID-19 on orders generally, including those that have been made before lockdown, but the orders perhaps aren't yet drawn because you might have another way of getting out of those. And I'm also going to have a look at what to do going forward with cases that haven't yet been finalised. If you've got any comments or questions, put them in the comments box, the chat box, and I'll see them all. I don't think you'll be able to see everybody's questions. You'll only be able to see what you're writing. So obviously if there's any really tricky ones, I'll just ignore those. But I'll try and answer as many questions as I can at the end. So very quick recap on is COVID-19 a Barder event? There was a poll on Twitter about this, is this a Barder event? And most of the answers were, unsurprisingly, I don't know. There were many, don't care. And the rest were initially split pretty evenly between yes or no. I then put my blog up. The poll remained pretty split, but then the yeses outweighed the noes marginally. But the punchline to this webinar is it might be, but hopefully you won't log out just yet. So the law, you'll all know that Barder came from the very tragic case of Barder in the late 1980s, where husband transferred the house to wife, and about a month later, wife killed the two children and committed suicide. And unsurprisingly, the court decided that that was a new event that had validated the basis or fundamental assumption on which the order was made. The principles to come out of the case were that essentially you needed to tick 4 boxes for it to be a Barder event. New events occurring which invalidate the basis upon which the order was made. The new events have occurred within a relatively short period of time, and further case law shows us that it's essentially within about a year. And the application for leave to appeal has to be made promptly, and interests of third parties shouldn't be prejudiced. Since the decision in Barder, the vast majority of applications for Barder appeals have failed. It's a notoriously high-risk application to make. In 21 years at the bar, I have yet to run a Barder argument. I have defended 3 of them successfully. 2 concerned my client receiving an inheritance shortly after the order was made, and 1 was where my client died. But as the husband's case at final hearing had been put on the basis of wife being such a raving alcoholic, she probably wouldn't need a house for long, that obviously didn't get very far. The supervening event has to be unforeseen and unforeseeable. Interestingly, Barder itself didn't specifically refer to foreseeability, but case laws made it clear that it's implicit that the event must not be reasonably foreseeable. In effect, it's something that comes as a bolt from the blue. The case that's going to cause real problems in trying to run a Barder on the basis of saying, for instance, Mr. Husband's £500,000 shareholding is now worth £50,000 is the case of Meyerson and Meyerson, and that the details of that are on the blog. But in that case, husband sought to appeal a consent order that was made at FDR, which provided for a 57% split in his favour of what at the time the agreement was reached was a £25 million asset base. He agreed to pay wife a lump sum of 9.5 million in tranches. He paid the first tranche and then he stopped paying. And at appeal, he said because of the collapse of the stock market and the housing market, that the net result now was that actually he was only getting 14% rather than the 57%. And the new event was the financial meltdown in the world markets. At the time the order was agreed in March 2008, his shares are worth about 15 million and trading at about £3 a share. The market dropped. That was one of those things. But by November 2008, the shares plummeted to £1.41 and husband headed back to court saying this is Barder. And by the time the Barder appeal was heard, the shares were worth 27.5p each, so a 90% drop since the order was made. Mr. Mostyn QC acted for wife, and what he said is that all share prices went up and down, and he referred to husband as being the captain of a great ship, currently in stormy waters, but still steaming on. But what if the great ship post-COVID-19 is not steaming on? It's locked down. It's a gardening business, and the gardeners are quite rightly saying, I'm not going to go and risk my life digging up a lawn. It's not essential work. So husband, in charge of 20 gardeners, has got a business that's currently surviving off age debt, very much like the bar. The business isn't even chugging on, let alone steaming on. In the case of Meyerson, Lord Justice Thorpe went through the categories into which a case must fall for it to be considered under the Barder principles in terms of a change in asset value. First of all, he considered where an asset correctly valued at trial changes in value a short time later owing to what he called the natural processes of price fluctuation. That's not Barder, and it was found that Meyerson fell very, very clearly into that first category. The categories where there could be a new order made was mistaken valuation of an asset at trial, so effectively a set aside, and then something unforeseen and unforeseeable, so a Barder event. And the case law taken as a whole doesn't suggest that the natural processes of price fluctuation, whether in houses, shares, or any other property, fall within this principle. And the Court of Appeal was very, very clear. But how relevant, I would question, was the fact that Mr. Meyerson had already invoked the statutory power of variation in relation to the instalments. He did have an out of his agreement to some extent, and the impact of that out really isn't very clear. Also, and I think this might be important, is that this wasn't a court-imposed order. This was a consent order. Mr. Meyerson had chosen to take the shares. He took the shares with the potential risk and the potential gain that they came with. He elected to take those risky assets. And I do wonder if it had been a court-imposed order, whether the outcome in fact would have been different. Also, Mr. Meyerson had given various undertakings to give securities, and he could have asked to be released from those, but he didn't. So Mr. Meyerson had other options open to him outside of Barder, and he elected to take the shares. So is COVID-19 a Barder event? Well, I don't know, but I think it very, very much could be. Mr. Mostyn's submissions for wife in Meyerson that a Barder condition demands the indication of some concrete new event, such as the liquidation of the company, was firmly rejected by the court. The court said that would be to put too narrow an interpretation of the definition of the first condition. Events in this context embrace happenings, developments, or occurrences. The central question now, looking at COVID-19 and whether that's a Barder event, seems to me to centre around the fact that Mr. Myerson's 90% drop in share prices was said to be a natural process of price fluctuation, and that wasn't enough to reopen an order. Does it matter if the 90% drop is due to something totally unforeseeable, the likes of which none of us have ever seen or imagined? If you were for wife and husband's bringing the Barder now, you'd be saying, well, what the hell difference does it make why his shares have crashed? Shares crash, that's foreseeable, that's clear from Myerson. And it's quite possible that that argument would shut the case down there and then with a costs order against the applicant husband bringing the Barder appeal. Does it make a difference why there's been a change, why the shares have crashed? And bluntly, we don't know. Does it make a difference what the change is? The case law taken as a whole seems to close the door on a Barder appeal based on a change of value of the assets, however big the drop. And Myerson in a Barder is going to be an absolute massive hurdle. But the issue remains, the natural processes of price fluctuation, however dramatic, don't satisfy the Barder test. So if husband's shares in Hargreaves Lansdowne crash by 80% as a result of COVID, then it's probably going to be very difficult to run as a Barder following Myerson, but I don't think it's impossible. The bear market was specifically referenced in Myerson, and that's where the market basically crashes by 20% or more. But is a huge market dip, like Mr. Myerson had, the same as a COVID market dip, where bluntly many businesses are going to fold? How businesses will be run, not simply how they'll perform post-COVID, is unknown. It may well be that how businesses function will alter quite dramatically. This isn't a market or business dip, the likes of which we've ever encountered. At no other time in our lifetimes has the government locked down a country and fined people for going out to their friends for a cup of tea or gin. These are unprecedented times, and certainly to my mind, I would say this is patently not foreseeable. What if it isn't shares per se or the capital value of the business that's been slashed? What if husband's kept his very high income generating business and wife's kept the house in return for a clean break? Husband was, let's say, a taxidermist, specialising in the import and sale of dead bats from China. Bizarre a situation as this might sound, I have to tell you, I do in fact have a stuffed bat and bat skeleton mounted in my spare bedroom, much to the horror of my guests who stay there. Ladies and gentlemen, Carolyn, I told you I had a prop. Meet Meghan and Harry. I've now totally forgotten what I was saying. Oh yes, so does it matter what's affected by COVID? I think probably yes. If husband was making £300,000 a year importing bats from China, it's a fair assumption that that income stream is as dead as my bats, Meghan and Harry. If, for instance, husband retains shares in, let's say, a small airline, then again, that's likely to be a business that will go under before we get to the other side of COVID. Same story for travel agents. So why wouldn't the court say COVID is a Barder event in the case of Mr. Taxidermist? Bluntly, I think there's really only one way they can get out of it, or one reason they'd get out of it, and that's the risk of floodgates. Because surely COVID-19 is more than the natural process of price fluctuation. Is COVID-19 part of the speculative nature of business owning or shareholding? I'd suggest it clearly isn't. Some cases of pneumonia were reported in China on the 31st of December last year. 1 week later, Chinese authorities confirmed they'd identified a new virus, now known as COVID-19. The virus, probably first transmitted from an animal, possibly Meghan or Harry my bats, is now spreading globally at an alarming rate, with all countries taking extreme measures. It's a pandemic. The fiscal measures introduced by the government are unprecedented. Guaranteed earnings, unless you're self-employed and last year earned over £50,000. The fact we're now all earning 25p is deemed irrelevant, but I digress. The government's deferred tax payments, given business loans, schools are closed, were locked down. This isn't simply stock markets crashing. This is not natural price fluctuation. It simply isn't. This was not foreseen. It was not foreseeable. The test of foreseeability is an objective one, but cutting a lot of legal debate and law down into a simple sentence, was COVID-19 and the effects reasonably foreseeable? I'd say patently not. Share prices go up and down for many reasons, but this is a worldwide pandemic, the likes of which haven't been seen in any of our lifetimes. We won't go back to how we were before, whatever the financial position. Significant numbers of people will die, and the way companies organise themselves post-COVID-19 could well change. Will there be the huge importation from China, for instance? Probably not. And none of this, I would say, was foreseeable. Barder won't help you for making a bad bet generally, but surely this goes way beyond that. The courts are very likely to be fearful of floodgates, and as I've said, Meyerson is authority that 70% drops in value isn't enough for a Barder. But personally, I think that for deals done in the last few months before COVID-19 was a household word, I think there's a very real argument that this is Barder in certain circumstances. Any deals we do now won't be Barder because we'll be doing a deal on the basis of a known unknown. So parties will now do a deal, taking the risks with their eyes wide open. But if you've done a deal within the last 3 months, I, for one, think that we might well be in Barder territory. So imagine Mr. Holiday and Mrs. Holiday had a final hearing in the first week of January of this year. Mr. Holiday kept his business, a travel agent's, valued at £500,000, which was principally goodwill, and he kept his income stream. He got a clean break. The rationale was he could take some liquidity out of the business by way of a dividend, he could put down a deposit on a house, and he could use his income to pay the mortgage. And Mrs. Holiday kept the £500,000 matrimonial home. Fast forward to now. Mr. Holiday's been told by the government that he has to close his business. He can apply for loans, he can defer tax and the like, but the reality is his business is currently worth next to nothing, and it's unlikely to ride out the lockdown. Even if by some miracle it does stay afloat until the end of lockdown, people are likely to be too skint to book a holiday and or too scared to get on a plane within the time frame that Mr. Holiday is going to need to avoid liquidation. If Mr. and Mrs. Holiday's decision was being taken today, there's no way he would have agreed to sign over the house to Mrs. Holiday, and it seems highly unlikely that a court would order such a thing today. So there's been a huge change because a bat passed a virus to a human in China in December. We didn't know about it until this year after the deal's done or the decision's been made. By the time the order takes effect, we're locked down and the world's changed forever. How is that not a Barder? Bluntly, I think it is. The question is, will the courts treat it as a Barder? I suggest they should, but I suspect the fear of floodgates means that they could get creative. It wouldn't be the first time, but certainly in certain circumstances, I think there's going to be a very, very good Barder argument to be run, particularly where the order was made by the court rather than agreed by the parties. A couple of other points I want to address, which may or may not have occurred to people, but an alternative and little known possibility that isn't in my blog is something called the Barrel jurisdiction. The case of Barrel is a case that came to my attention last Monday. I did a contested occupation order instructed by Matt Handley at JMW. Hello, Matt. I said, he said he'd give me a bottle of wine if I gave him a shout out. The case that I did last Monday was done remotely with Leeds County Court, and wife was ousted from the house so that husband and the children could return. So we did that on Monday morning and afternoon, and then 4 hours post-judgment, but before counsel had even started drafting the relatively complicated order, the government announced that we were going into lockdown, and basically you couldn't then go and get a new tenancy. What a fun evening I had looking at the law and responding to the 11 billion messages from Matt following messages from the client as we all watched TV with absolute horror. And what I found was a case that you may already be familiar with. In all honesty, I wasn't, called Barrel Enterprises, and that's 1973 1WLR 19. There's been lots and lots and lots of case law since 1973, obviously, which expanded upon Barrel and which was rounded up very nicely in a case called L and B, and that's a 2013 case, UK SC 8. And in that case, the Supreme Court considered whether and in what circumstances a judge who's announced her decision is entitled to change her mind before the order's actually drawn. And Baroness Hale reviewed the authorities at some length, looking in particular at whether the discretion to vary decisions should be limited to exceptional circumstances as per Barrel Enterprises. And in brief, she said, no, the court isn't bound by Barrel or by any of the cases which held that there's any limitation upon the acknowledged jurisdiction of the judge to revisit his own decision at any time up until the resulting order is perfected. The overriding objective has to be to deal with cases justly, and a carefully considered change of mind can be sufficient. Every case is going to depend upon its particular circumstances. So if you're waiting for a judgment or an order, you might want to invite the judge to revisit his or her decision under Barrel, and only if that's refused, then maybe make an application under Barder. But certainly if you don't have a perfected order yet, it's open the judge to basically chuck it in the bin and come up with something completely different. But as I say, remember, anything you agree from now going forwards is not going to be a Barder because we're into the known unknown territory. So moving on from Barder and Barrel, what about cases we're looking at now? Well, obviously we need a lot of care agreeing things at the moment. For some, of course, there could be a big advantage settling things now when share values are low, if your client thinks that his business actually will do quite well, but the stock market's saying it's worth next to nothing, but he knows there's something in the pipeline, you know, maybe he's going to want to do a deal now. We could, of course, just delay everything until we know where we are. But I think we've got to be very careful about that, because how long are we going to wait? 3 months, 6 months, a year? Really, we don't know. First of all, we don't know when the court's going to actually hear us, and we don't know how long it's going to take, frankly, to work out which, if any, businesses are going to survive, which are going to go down, and which are actually going to do better as a result of COVID-19. But just getting into court now, if we're issuing now and saying, well, actually, I think we'll just hold fire, we could be in limbo for months, frankly, if not years. Certainly 95% of my March, April diary has simply adjourned off to, frankly, God knows when. So whilst my diary at the moment is full May onwards, I fully expect the week before we get to the date, it will be adjourned and the court will say, we'll write back to you, and then we'll get a date, and then that'll be adjourned again. So I think just delaying things could be delaying it till really, frankly, the end of time. But if we do deals now, we're into known unknown, and it won't be Barder, because now everything's foreseeable, yet frankly nothing is. There are ways we can protect clients if there's uncertainty about the true value of the business, for instance, and there's an order to give wife a lump sum. If we're acting for husband, then I think I'm probably going to be pushing let's pay the lump sum in instalments. So if the arse does drop out of his business, then he can apply to vary it down. There will be some cases, no doubt, that will simply have to be adjourned off for a final decision. And it may well depend where your case is, because certainly the cases that I've got in London seem to be going on as normal. Leeds seem to still be working. But the Midlands court, my circuit at least, seems to be kicking all the Ansell cases off into the long grass. I literally don't have one that's been left in my diary beyond in April. So the backlog when this is over is going to be quite simply eye-watering. And what I'd urge you to do is frankly to get some private FDRs in place. So there will be a cost to the clients, but the only additional cost is going to be paying for the private FDR judge, but it could avoid a lot of delay. It can be done safely. You know, you've got a judge who's got all day. You're not going to be in a list with 20 other people. You can choose your judge. You can get rid of the risk of having a bit of a mad one. And I do think that for the short term, if not longer, private FDRs is going to be the way forwards for us. If there are some things that can't be resolved without a judge making an actual decision, then of course you could go to arbitration for that. You could have a single issue arbitration. So if you've got an issue over a valuation, for instance, and you can't agree who the single joint expert is, that single issue arbitration could be dealt with very quickly, very cheaply, frankly, and very often on written submission. So there's lots of flexibility. We've also got to consider that it's quite possible that values we got last month are now, frankly, meaningless. Are we going to need to start doing 2 schedules now, an almost pre and post COVID schedule? What are the housing needs now? What will a house cost post-COVID? Well, maybe the answer is something different in September this year till September next year. What are lenders going to lend? Will the lending criteria get stricter post-COVID? I imagine so, but I don't know. So settling now is going to be risky, but adjourning until God knows when is also risky. we all know that we had ridiculous delays before COVID. After COVID, and when the dust settled, Mr. Business Owner or Mrs. Housewife might found out that he or she in fact would have been a lot better doing the deal in spring 2020 than waiting for a decision in winter 2021. I mean, it really is a case of roll them dice. But if Mr. and Mrs. have to remain under the same roof until they do a deal, any deal, frankly, that the money might be irrelevant, because one of them might be upon a murder charge if they have to remain living with their ex until the end of 2022. So sometimes I say to clients, well, I think the answer is somewhere between X and Y. I don't think his offer's brilliant. It's okay. I think you'd probably do a bit better if you come back and have a fight. But if you do a deal today, you've got certainty you can get on with your life, because there's a value to you that isn't financial in this. And I suspect that having been locked down with spouses or wannabe ex-spouses for 2 weeks, that may seem like a very long time already. And if we're still locked down in 2 months, I do suspect that many spouses will just want to do any deal in the hope they can get out of it with some money and, frankly, their liberty. So, to conclude, Barder, possibly, very much depends on the circumstances, but I personally think it's a real run in the right circumstances. Barrel, for those orders which haven't been drawn yet, I think that's a very real possibility. And going forwards, it's a known unknown. We're in a brave new world. This last couple of weeks have been a very steep learning curve for most lawyers. Certainly I hadn't heard of Zoom until 2 weeks ago, and now St. Philip's Family Group have got a daily Zoom meeting, and it's frankly a good thing just to see faces other than my husband's and son's. I'm also enjoying seeing other people's kitchens, studies, and in some cases estates through the window. That's Francesca. I also enjoy seeing random kids, dogs, cats. I think I'm probably the first one to bring bats to a Zoom meeting, so I'm feeling particularly smug about that. Carolyn and I noted yesterday when we were having a text message chat while watching a webinar that most lawyers have really crap artwork. So have a think about what's behind you all. I've got quite a nice Bob Dylan going on at the moment behind me. I've got quite a good fallen angel one with a tequila bottle, but Carolyn said that probably wasn't appropriate, so I'll bow to her superior wisdom on that. But it's a scary time for us as lawyers. Certainly I think those of us at the bar who have, probably most of us have seen our income drop about 99%, frankly, overnight. But what's keeping Carolyn and I afloat, at least, is the thought that going forwards, there's going to have to be a lot of divorces. It's just a given. And with Barder, as soon as a lawyer says, oh, that's an interesting legal question, of course, what that means is expensive. So though we might be earning next to nothing now, in the long run, especially after spouses have been locked down together for weeks or months, I have to imagine that the divorce rates will soar, and we'll look back on this lull with longing. But it's not business as usual. Diaries are collapsing in large part due to court logistics. I used to have solicitors calling me constantly saying, oh, Leisha, you're never available. How do I instruct you? Well, the good news is you almost certainly can book me in pretty much any day over the next month. So book your spaces now. You'll find lots of barristers at St. Philip's are available at short notice and elsewhere. And any barristers who were telling you how busy they are, bluntly, they're lying because none of us are. As always, specific circumstances means that one size doesn't fit all. And while COVID might not be a Barder event for Mr. Sports Direct, I certainly think it would be a Barder event for Mr. Taxidermist. So I'll have lots of time to advise you and all your Misters and Misses, so send your advice requests in quickly. But that's the promo, Leisha promo over. So let me just see if there are any questions. From Antonia. Presumably house prices could be distinguished from shares on the account of the property being considered a safe investment. Well, I don't think there is such a thing as a safe investment anymore, quite honestly. Certainly I thought my investments were pretty safe, and I turned on my computer and saw 65% drop off them overnight and hit sell and cried a bit and drank quite a lot of gin. Properties generally are considered quite safe, but the housing market is now in lockdown, and I don't think, frankly, that's ever happened. So reading various things in the news with estate agents and the like, and it seems that what's anticipated, but of course we don't know, is that going forward the value of houses is going to drop quite drastically. But it's complete guesswork. But I think shares are going to be the most problematic, because we've got Meyerson that deals with shares, but Meyerson did refer to shares, properties, businesses. It put it all actually into the same bag, if you like. So I think it's going to be the same problem, whether it's a house or shares. Although I certainly think there's an argument to say, well, actually the house, it was always reasonable to assume that would be the safest of the assets. Any other questions? Don't think so. If anyone's got
Alicia, sorry to interrupt there. It's Anthony here, Family Clerk. I'm not sure if you're seeing all the questions, actually. I did retype that Antonio one out when I realised.
Oh, no.
Once I can read out some of the questions for you now.
Oh, okay. Damn, I was hoping
the more difficult ones first. Yeah. So from Carolyn Jones, she says, her question is, why aren't Harry and Meghan the Bats adhering to social distancing rules?
Well, this is because, Carolyn, they're part of the same household, and they have been, in fact, in this since I bought them the first week of January. So although they are COVID-free, I do fear that they may have started COVID, particularly Harry, because he's really not looking well at the moment. I'm a bit worried about him. But thanks for the question, Carolyn.
Okay, from Jane Wright, should we consider getting pension reports revalued in light of the stock market crash?
Well, I was looking, actually just before I came on, and I took a photo of this so I didn't forget. The pensions regulations guidance people have apparently just released that trustees can now decide to suspend CETV quotations and payments to give themselves time to review CETV terms. It depends what your pensions are and what the mix is. So briefly, things to consider: actuarial. Lower stock market values are going to have an immediate impact on defined contribution money purchase valuations. An increased possibility of private sector DB schemes having significant debts and therefore paying reduced transfer values. Massive reduction in gilt yields, which will have an immediate impact on annuity rates. They'll be reduced, but it could potentially increase the cash equivalent transfer value for many private sector defined benefit schemes. So it very much depends on what you've got in the scheme. If you've only got, for instance, public sector defined benefit schemes, so NHS, police, that kind of thing, I think it's unlikely that there's going to be any impact on any pension sharing settlement, because in those schemes no money leaves the scheme, it's all internal implementation, so they're effectively immune from what's happening on the market. But if you're looking at offsetting, then the reduction in the gilt yield might mean that the cost of offsetting actually should be higher. So it really depends what you've got in the pot, and if you've got a mixed bag, I think that's where the risks are going to come in. I mean, I had this conversation with an instructing solicitor of mine a few days ago. What about pensions? And because it's very much an unknown, and obviously CETVs will only be calculated, you know, a few months hence, if you like. It could well be that we agree everything, but say pensions we're going to have to come back to work out how it's done. But I certainly think offsetting a pension is going to be very risky, because you could put the pension on the back burner, but if it's an offset, I think you're getting into slightly risky territory, depending upon what sort of pension you've got. But if you've got a real mixed bag of pensions, I think you've got a real problem there.
Okay, from Mina Rupal, what if there is an agreement made a year ago, heads of agreement signed, then no order was produced until now? Should we sign or refuse, wait until an application for notice to show cause is made, and plead delay, barder, or something else?
Heads of agreement, what was that? Heads of agreement a year ago?
Yes, that's right. Signed a year ago. Made a year ago, heads of agreement signed.
I don't think I'd be signing up to it. I think I'd be saying we're issuing, and if the other side, I mean, it depends. Obviously, it depends on the circumstances. But on the face of it, I think I'd be saying I'm not signing up to it. And we had a head of agreement, and you could almost be under Barrel and Barder. And also you're going to have arguments about concluded agreements as well. So you're into a bit of a legal minefield, which obviously from a financial point of view for the lawyers is excellent. But I'd need to know more about the specifics, but on the face of it, I wouldn't be signing.
From Jenny Arnold, please can Alicia expand upon the type of evidence which would be required to support a Barder application if brought by a husband who is the business owner, i.e. to show the impact on their business liquidity when annual accounts are not available?
Well, I suspect you'd be looking at things like, well, now most businesses now are making, frankly, next to nothing. So you're going to be looking at showing bank statements now, your VAT returns, management accounts, that sort of thing. So comparing and contrasting this, you know, January to March, I made whatever this year. This is what I made last year. March till June, 0. So it's really sort of the comparing and contrasting what you had historically with what you've got now. But you could well be into the territory of having to get a single joint expert in for that, I would have thought.
Okay. Time for a few more, Alicia?
Yeah.
From Abigail Bennett, in Meyerson, the Court of Appeal made much of the fact that H had done a deal which left him in control, and that there was no justification for rewriting the bargain at his behest. Had the shares shot up, he would have benefited from that. You touched on this before, but do you think that the distinction between a consent order and the court-imposed order is likely to be a very important if pursuing Barder? What about cases that simply cannot be implemented because of C19? For example, H was to borrow a lump sum to buy out W from company, but now cannot do that due to suspension in lending.
I mean, I think that you've got a real problem if you've signed up to something that can still be implemented. So husband took the shares, they dropped in value. He can give the wife the money, but it effectively leaves him with nothing. Following Meyerson, husband's got a problem with that. If he can't get the lump sum, because he can't now borrow it because of COVID, then I think that puts you more into Barder, if you like. But I do think that if you haven't elected to take the risky assets, the shares and the business, I think you're probably on safer ground. But I mean, I think if you did a complete copy of Meyerson and ran it now in COVID, I suspect the court would follow Meyerson and say, well, frankly, it's just tough, isn't it? But I think a lot of what technically should be COVID Barder events, the court's going to say no, they're not, because they're just going to be afraid of floodgates. So I think if they can say, well, you took the risky assets, that was your lookout. That's why I think there will be a real difference between whether someone's signed up to it and an FDR or whatever, or whether the court's imposed it. But I think if the husband then can't actually fulfill the order because he can't borrow, then I think that puts you into a better position than if it's just a case of it doesn't leave with half as much as you thought. If he actually can't do it, I think the court's going to be in difficulty saying that's not Barder if he didn't sign up to it. I hope that answers that.
Okay, from Robert Adams. I have a case where terms are agreed in December, but no order yet filed with the court. The circumstances are almost all on all fours with Leisha's holiday analogy. H has taken a business and should be paying a lump sum and signing over, transferring the family home to wife. His business is pub nightclub and is closed and rapidly running the risk of never reappearing after the closure is revisited. Wife may argue this is a rose agreement and should be enforceable. How would this potentially be dealt with? ? Show cause application.
Did you say that the order hadn't actually been drawn yet?
No order filed yet with the court.
Barrel jurisdiction, invite the court to do something different.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, let me find the reference, because there's a lot of really, really long-winded, boring case law on this, and most of it isn't actually even family law, so it was very hard to read. But the summary is L&B Children, 2013, UK SC 8. In fact, I'll put it onto the comments here, and then people can see it, hopefully. I don't know if people can see that. But that tells you basically everything you're going to need to know about Barrel. Well, maybe not everything, but quite a lot.
Okay, that would be all the questions.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. It's nice to see some different faces. And I hope you like my bats, Carolyn. I can see your face now. Just give me the thumbs up. Okay, thank you.